My name is Aurora. I'm 32 years old, and on the darkest day of my life, the day I buried my husband, every pew stood empty. Not one parent, not one sibling, not even my best friend. I stood alone beside his coffin, the silence in the church louder than any scream. But that silence was just the beginning. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. The funeral home felt cold, not just from the October air but from the emptiness. It was a large room, meant to be filled with the warmth of shared grief. Instead, there were only vast rows of polished wood and hollow space. Besides me, there were only 3 other people. The pastor, a kind man with sad eyes who didn't know my husband, David, beyond a few stories I'd shared over the phone. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable, who had brought over a tuna casserole yesterday, her hands trembling, and one of David's colleagues from work, a quiet man named Robert, who stood awkwardly in the back, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. I sat in the front row, a space reserved for family. It was a cruel joke. I was the only family there. My hands were clenched in my lap, my black dress feeling thin against the chill. The pastor began to speak. His voice was a low, soothing hum, but I couldn't absorb the words. All my attention was on the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel. They'll come, I told myself. They have to, I imagined the scene. The doors would swing open. My mother would be there, her face etched with regret. My father would be right behind her, his usual stern expression softened by loss. My sister Clara would rush in, her eyes red from crying, and she would wrap her arms around me and whisper how sorry she was. Even my best friend Sarah, who was practically my other sister, would be there. They were late, that's all. There was traffic. Something came up. Any excuse would do. I was desperate for an excuse. The pastor spoke of David's kindness, his laugh, his love for hiking in the state park. I could barely hear him over the frantic beating of my own heart. I saw flashes of David in my mind. The way he'd smile when I walked into a room. The time he stayed up all night with me when I had the flu, putting cold cloths on my forehead. The day he proposed, right there on our favorite trail, with the autumn leaves falling around us like confetti. He was my whole world, and now he was gone. The pain was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. But beneath the grief, another feeling was starting to curdle. A cold, sharp anxiety. I kept glancing at my phone, which I'd placed on the pew beside me. No calls, no texts, nothing. It had been silent since yesterday morning when I sent the family a group message with the funeral details. The only reply I'd received was a single, dismissive text from my mother. Aurora, we'll talk about this later. Today is very important for Clara. Today. My sister's engagement party. The thought hit me like a physical blow. When my mother had mentioned it, I'd assumed they would postpone it. Or at least, that they would come to the funeral first and then go to the party. It seemed like the only human thing to do. Who would choose a party over a funeral? Who would celebrate a new beginning while my world was ending? My family, apparently. The image became painfully clear in my mind. While I sat here, surrounded by emptiness, they were in my parents' beautifully decorated backyard. There would be champagne flutes clinking, laughter echoing off the manicured lawns. My sister, Clara, would be the center of attention, her hand flashing a diamond ring, her smile bright and perfect. My mother would be beaming, fussing over the catering. My father would be telling a story to a circle of impressed guests. They would be taking pictures, capturing memories of a joyous day. And I was here, burying the love of my life. I imagined them posing for a family photo. My parents, my sister, and her new fiancé, maybe even Sarah, her arm linked with Clara's. They would all be smiling, a perfect, happy family. And I wouldn't be in the picture. I had been cropped out, erased. The pastor said, "Let us pray." I bowed my head, but I didn't pray. I just stared at the floor, at the floral pattern on the carpet. The doors at the back of the chapel remained shut. No one was coming. They weren't late. They had simply made a choice. They had chosen a party over me. They had chosen celebration over my grief. They had chosen my sister, like they always did. It wasn't a new feeling. It was a familiar ache that had lived in my chest since childhood. Clara was the bright one, the social one, the easy one. I was quiet, serious, and in their eyes, difficult. They loved me, I suppose, in their own way, but they adored her. Every achievement of hers was a cause for a grand celebration. Every achievement of mine was met with a polite nod before the conversation turned back to Clara. When David and I got married, my parents paid for a small, simple ceremony. For Clara's engagement, they had hired event planners and were talking about a wedding that would cost more than my house. I had always accepted it. It was just the way things were. But this was different. This wasn't about who got the bigger party or the more expensive gift. This was about basic human decency. This was about showing up when someone you claim to love is broken. The pastor finished his prayer. Mrs. Gable patted my shoulder gently. Robert from David's office gave me a small, sad nod. The service was over, and my family was not there. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, it felt like a second death. I was a widow, yes, but in that cold, empty chapel, I also became an orphan. The truth settled into my bones, heavy and cold as stone. I was completely and utterly alone. The drive to the cemetery was a blur. I followed the hearse, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The sky was a sheet of flat, unforgiving gray. The trees lining the road were bare, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the clouds. It felt like the world was mourning with me, even if my family wasn't. At the graveside, the cold was even more biting. A raw wind whipped across the open field, cutting through my dress and chilling me to the bone. The small group gathered around the open plot of earth. The pastor, Mrs. Gable, Robert, and me. The coffin, a dark, polished cherry wood that David would have admired for its craftsmanship, was suspended over the grave. The pastor read a final passage from the Bible. His words were carried away by the wind, snatched up before they could offer any comfort. My eyes were fixed on the coffin. David was in there. The man who held my hand while we watched movies. The man who made me coffee every morning, exactly how I liked it. The man whose scent still lingered on his pillow at home. It was impossible. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Then came the moment I dreaded most. The cemetery workers began to lower the coffin into the ground. The machinery whirred softly, a clinical sound in the sacred silence. I stood frozen, watching it descend, deeper and deeper until it rested at the bottom. It looked so small and lonely down there. The pastor handed me a single white rose. My hand trembled as I took it. I stepped forward, my shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. I looked down into the grave at the lid of the coffin and whispered, "I love you." The words were stolen by the wind. I dropped the rose. It fluttered down and landed softly in the center of the coffin, a single spot of purity in the darkness. Then came the sound. The first shovel of dirt hit the coffin lid. Thud. The sound was dull, final, and absolute. It was the sound of forever. It echoed not just in the air, but inside my soul. It was the sound of the door closing, the lock turning. Thud, another shovel full. Each thud was a hammer blow to my heart. It wasn't just dirt hitting wood. It was the sound of every future plan we had made being buried. The trip to Italy we were saving for. The children we had just started trying for. The quiet, simple life we had promised each other, growing old on our porch swing. Thud, thud. My hands, clutching the folded funeral program, began to shake uncontrollably. The program was simple, something I had designed myself on the computer late last night. It had a picture of David on the front, smiling on top of a mountain during one of our hikes. Inside, it listed the order of the service that had just been performed for an audience of 3. It felt like a piece of evidence from a crime scene. My fingers tightened around the glossy paper. The faces of my family flashed in my mind, not with sorrow, but with bright, party-ready smiles. My mother, adjusting Clara's hair for a photo. My father laughing with Clara's fiancé. My sister holding up her champagne glass for a toast. They were toasting while David was being lowered into the earth. Thud. The sound seemed to knock the air from my lungs. A wave of something hot and sharp surged through me. A feeling so intense it eclipsed the grief for a moment. It was rage. Pure, undiluted rage. My knuckles were white as I squeezed the program. The paper crumpled, creased, and then, with a soft, tearing sound, it ripped in half. I looked down at the 2 pieces in my hands. The picture of David was torn right down the middle, and in that moment, as the dirt continued to fall, the full weight of my reality crashed down on me. The grief was not just for David. That was a clean, pure pain, a pain born of love. This other feeling was messy, ugly, and rotten. I was grieving something else entirely. I was grieving the family I thought I had. I was grieving the illusion that they loved me. Love doesn't do this. Love doesn't choose a party over a funeral. Love doesn't abandon you on the worst day of your life. Love shows up. Love sits with you in the silence. Love holds your hand while your world falls apart. They hadn't just forgotten me or been too busy. They had made a deliberate choice. They had looked at my profound pain and their own selfish pleasure, weighed them on a scale, and decided that my pain was worth less. They had chosen to erase me from their day, just as they had erased me from their lives in so many small ways over the years. This wasn't a mistake. This was a statement. It was a declaration of my worth in their eyes, and my worth was nothing. The ripping of the program was more than just an accident. It was a symbol, It was the sound of my last hope tearing, the last thread of connection to them snapping. They were not my family. Not anymore. A family wouldn't leave one of their own to stand alone at a grave. The hole in the ground wasn't just for my husband. It was for my childhood, for my belief in my parents' love, for my bond with my sister. Everything I thought was real about them was being buried under shovelfuls of cold, hard earth. I wasn't just saying goodbye to David. I was saying goodbye to all of them. And the realization left me colder than any winter wind ever could. I don't remember walking back to my car. It felt like my body was moving on its own while my mind was still standing at the graveside, listening to the thud of the dirt. I think Mrs. Gable said something and I probably nodded, but I couldn't tell you what it was. My ears were filled with a high-pitched ringing. I finally found myself sitting in the driver's seat of my car, the engine off, the keys dangling from the ignition. The cemetery was quiet now. The workers were gone. The pastor had driven away. I was alone in a sea of headstones, silent sentinels to loss. The gray sky pressed down on the windshield. I just sat there, staring blankly at the bare trees. I couldn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a hollow, frozen place inside my chest where my heart used to be. I felt nothing and everything all at once. The grief for David was a vast, dark ocean. The betrayal by my family was a shard of ice piercing through it. How long I sat there, I don't know. Minutes or an hour. Time had lost its meaning. The world had stopped making sense. My husband was dead. My family was celebrating. Nothing was right. Then, my phone, which I had tossed onto the passenger seat, lit up. The screen glowed in the dim light of the car, a sudden intrusion into my silent bubble of pain. For a wild, hopeful second, my heart leaped. Maybe it's them. Maybe they're apologizing. Maybe they realized what they've done. I leaned over and picked it up. My hands were still trembling. There were 2 new messages, one from my sister Clara, one from my mom. I opened Clara's first. It was a text message. The letters were crisp and black against the white screen. Hope you understand. Today had to be about me. I read the words once, then twice, then a third time. I waited for them to change, to rearrange themselves into something that made sense, something that sounded human. They didn't. Hope you understand. As if her engagement party and my husband's funeral were 2 equally valid social events that unfortunately clashed. As if my grief was a minor inconvenience she hoped I would be polite enough to overlook. Today had to be about me. The selfishness of that sentence was breathtaking. It was so pure, so unapologetic. There was no room for my pain in her world. No room for my loss. Her happiness was the only thing that mattered, and my tragedy was just background noise. Something to be muted so it wouldn't interfere with her celebration. There was no apology, no remorse, just a demand for my understanding. A demand that I validate her choice to abandon me. Before I could even process the shock, the screen lit up with the notification for the second message. It was from my mom. We'll talk later. Don't make this harder than it has to be. My blood ran cold. It felt like a bucket of ice water had been dumped over my head. Don't make this harder than it has to be. The words were a threat wrapped in the guise of maternal advice. She wasn't comforting me. She was managing me. She was telling me to control my grief, to swallow my pain, to not cause a scene that might upset the family's delicate balance. She was telling me that my reaction to their monstrous cruelty was the problem, not the cruelty itself. My pain was an inconvenience. My husband's death was an obstacle. My funeral was a scheduling conflict. They had reduced the most catastrophic event of my life to a problem they needed to handle. There was no love in those words, no empathy, just cold, callous damage control. I dropped the phone back onto the passenger seat as if it had burned my hand. My heart, which I thought had frozen solid, now felt like it was cracking into 1,000 tiny pieces. This was worse than their absence. Their absence could have been explained away by some twisted logic, some profound failure of character. But these messages, this was confirmation. This was them, in their own words, telling me exactly how little I mattered. I finally understood. They didn't see me. They didn't see my pain. They saw a problem to be solved, an emotional mess to be contained so it wouldn't spoil their perfect day. I was not a daughter or a sister who was hurting. I was an obligation, a complication. I leaned my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes. The ringing in my ears grew louder. I thought of David, of his warm smile and the safety I felt in his arms. He had been my family. He had been my home, and now he was gone. And the people who were supposed to be my safety net, the people who were supposed to catch me, had just watched me fall and then texted to tell me not to make a mess when I hit the ground. The tears that wouldn't come before now began to fall. But they weren't tears of grief for David. They were hot, bitter tears of rage and disillusionment. I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was crying because I had been so stupid. So stupid to believe after all these years that they would ever put me first. So stupid to hope that in my darkest hour they would finally show up. They never would. And those two simple text messages, sent from a party while my husband's body was being lowered into the ground, were the proof. They were the final thud of dirt on the coffin of my old life. The next day, my house felt like a tomb. Every room was silent, filled with the ghosts of laughter and conversations that would never happen again. David's coffee mug was still by the sink. His jacket was still hanging on the hook by the door. I walked through the rooms like a ghost myself, touching his things, breathing in the faint scent of him that still lingered in the air. The casserole from Mrs. Gable sat untouched on the counter, a monument to a kindness I couldn't bring myself to accept. I hadn't slept. I had just sat on the sofa all night, wrapped in David's favorite blanket, staring at the blank television screen. The text from my mother and sister burned in my memory. I hadn't replied. What was there to say? You can't reason with people who live in a different reality, one where their desires are the center of the universe. Around noon, the doorbell rang. The sound was jarring, an unwelcome intrusion. I didn't want to see anyone, but it rang again, more insistent this time. I dragged myself to the door and looked through the peephole. My heart stopped. It was my parents. My father, tall and imposing. My mother, her posture rigid, her purse clutched in her hand like a weapon. A wave of nausea rolled over me. I didn't want them here. I didn't have the strength to face them, but I knew they wouldn't leave. I opened the door. The first thing I noticed was their clothes. My mother was wearing a pale blue silk dress, the kind you wear to a garden party. My father was in crisp trousers and a collared shirt. They were the same clothes from the pictures Clara had already posted online this morning. Pictures from her engagement party. They hadn't even bothered to change. They had come to their grieving daughter's house, the day after her husband's funeral, still dressed for a celebration. Aurora, my mother said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any warmth. She didn't move to hug me. She didn't even have the decency to look sad. Her eyes scanned the entryway of my home, a flicker of something I couldn't name. Appraisal. Maybe in her gaze. We need to talk, my father said, brushing past me and walking into the living room as if he owned the place. My mother followed him. I closed the door slowly, my hand shaking. This wasn't a condolence visit. There were no flowers in their hands, no comforting words on their lips. This was an ambush. I walked into the living room. They were already standing there looking around. My father's eyes landed on a painting David and I had bought on our honeymoon. My mother was looking at the furniture. What do you want? I asked. My voice was raspy. My mother finally looked at me. There was no sympathy in her eyes. There was only impatience. Aurora, we know this is a difficult time, she began, the words sounding rehearsed and hollow. Do you? I interrupted. Do you really? She stiffened. There's no need to be dramatic. We're here to help you be practical. Life goes on. My life ended 2 days ago, I whispered, the words barely audible. My father sighed, a sound of profound irritation. Listen, he said, taking a step forward. Clara's engagement is a very happy time for this family. We can't let this situation cast a shadow over it. This situation. He called my husband's death this situation. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were floating above my own body, watching this scene unfold. I couldn't believe this was real. Your husband, my father continued, his voice taking on a business-like tone. He was a successful man. He left assets behind. The house, savings, probably some investments. I stared at him, my mind unable to process where this was going. My mother stepped in, her voice softening into a sickly, sweet, manipulative tone she always used when she wanted something. Honey, your sister is just starting out. A wedding is expensive. Buying a house is expensive. She and Mark deserve a good start in life. They deserve support. And then it clicked. The final, horrifying piece of the puzzle fell into place. I understood why they were here. It wasn't about me. It wasn't even about them failing to comfort me. It was about something else entirely. It's only fair that you share, my father said, his voice firm and final. You're alone now. You don't need all of this. Your sister does. The family needs to support her. I couldn't speak. I just stared at them. They stood in my living room, surrounded by memories of my life with David, and they were vultures. They weren't here to mourn with me. They were here to pick over the bones of my dead husband's life. They saw his death not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity, a financial opportunity for their favored daughter. They had skipped his funeral, not just out of selfishness, but because they were already looking ahead. They were calculating. They were planning how to carve up my life and feed it to my sister. The icy calm that had settled over me in the cemetery returned, but this time it was different. It was harder, sharper. It was the calm of a person who has absolutely nothing left to lose. "So you're not here to say you're sorry," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "You're not here to see if I'm okay." "Of course we are," my mother said quickly, a flicker of panic in her eyes. She knew she had miscalculated. "But we also have to think of the family's future." "You are not my family," I said. The words came out before I even thought about them, a truth so profound it felt like it had been ripped from my soul. My father's face darkened with anger. "Don't you dare speak to your mother that way! Get out!" I said. "Excuse me?" He sputtered. "Get out of my house!" Each word was a block of ice. The house my husband paid for. The house you came to, not to comfort his widow, but to try and rob his grave. My mother gasped, placing a hand over her heart in a gesture of fake shock. "Aurora, how can you say such a thing?" "I can say it because it's the truth," I said, walking towards the door and pulling it open. "You are not welcome here. Not now. Not ever. Leave." They stood there for a moment, stunned into silence by my defiance. They were so used to me being quiet, to me just accepting my place in the family hierarchy. They had never seen this version of me before. I had never seen this version of me before. David was gone, but in his absence, he had left me with something I never knew I had, a backbone made of steel. My father's face was red with fury. He looked like he wanted to say more, to argue, to demand. But he saw something in my eyes that stopped him. He saw that I was done. Without another word, he turned and marched out the door. My mother gave me one last look, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock and contempt, before she hurried after him. I shut the door behind them, turned the deadbolt, and leaned my forehead against the cool wood. My body was shaking, but not from grief or fear. It was from the adrenaline of a battle I never thought I would have to fight. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a heartbroken victim they could manipulate and control. They were about to find out how wrong they were. That night, after my parents left, the house was quieter than ever. The adrenaline from our confrontation faded, leaving behind a profound and unsettling stillness. The anger had been a shield, but now, alone in the echoing silence, the grief for David rushed back in, vast and overwhelming. I curled up on the sofa, pulling his blanket up to my chin, and let the sorrow wash over me. I wasn't just mourning the man I loved. I was mourning the life we were supposed to have, a life now stolen from me. I must have drifted into a restless sleep, because I woke up in the dark, my neck stiff, with the disoriented feeling of having surfaced from a deep dive. The digital clock on the cable box glowed, 2:17 a.m. The house was cold. I got up, my joints aching, and walked aimlessly through the rooms. I ended up standing in front of the door to his study. It was the one room I hadn't been able to face. It was his sanctuary. The walls were lined with bookshelves he'd built himself, filled with everything from engineering textbooks to worn paperback thrillers. His big leather chair was still positioned by the window, a faint impression left in the cushion. The air in the room still held his scent, a faint mix of old books, coffee, and the sandalwood aftershave I'd bought him for his last birthday. My hand trembled on the doorknob. Entering felt like admitting he was truly gone, that he would never again sit in that chair or pull a book from those shelves. But the image of my parents' greedy, entitled faces flashed in my mind. They saw this house, this life David and I had built, as a collection of assets to be liquidated for Clara's benefit. They saw David's legacy as a piggy bank for my sister, a new kind of strength, cold and clear, pushed through the grief. I had to protect this. I had to protect him. I opened the door and stepped inside. The room was neat, just as he'd left it. A stack of papers was squared perfectly on the corner of his large oak desk. A pen lay beside a legal pad filled with his familiar sharp handwriting. It felt like he had just stepped out for a moment and would be right back. My heart ached with a longing so fierce it stole my breath. My eyes were drawn to the small, fireproof lockbox tucked away on the bottom shelf of his bookcase, partially hidden behind a row of encyclopedias. We had bought it together years ago, after a friend of ours had their house broken into. We kept our important documents in it, our passports, birth certificates, the deed to the house, and our wills. My own will was simple. If I died, everything went to David. I knew his was the same, a mirror image of mine. We were young, healthy. We thought we had a lifetime to worry about such things. It was just a formality. Now it was the only thing that mattered. My parents' words echoed in my head. "It's only fair that you share." They were counting on my grief to make me weak, to make me pliable. They were counting on family obligation, on years of me giving in to keep the peace. They assumed I would crumble. They probably thought David hadn't even had a will, and that his assets would be a chaotic mess they could easily claim a piece of. I knelt down and pulled the heavy box from the shelf. I carried it to the desk and set it down. The key was in the top desk drawer, in a small wooden dish where David kept loose change. My fingers felt clumsy as I fitted the small key into the lock. It turned with a solid, satisfying click. I lifted the lid. Inside, everything was in neatly labeled folders: passports, social security cards, deed of trust, and at the very back, a thick manila envelope simply labeled, Last Will and Testament, David Miller. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The legal proof of our life together. The document that my parents were so eager to disregard. I slid the thick stack of papers out of the envelope. It was professionally prepared, signed by David, and witnessed by 2 of his colleagues from work. I remembered the day he'd had it done about a year ago. He'd updated it after his father passed away and inherited a small portfolio of stocks. He'd come home and told me, "Just making sure you're always taken care of, Rory," using his pet name for me. I'd kissed him and told him not to be so morbid. Now his foresight was my only shield. I started to read, my finger tracing the legal language. The words were dense and formal, but the meaning was simple and absolute. He named me, Aurora Miller, as the sole executor of his estate. He bequeathed to me his beloved wife, all of his worldly possessions. It listed everything in meticulous detail, the house and the land it stood on, all funds held in our joint and his personal bank accounts, his retirement account, his life insurance policy, of which I was the sole beneficiary, the portfolio of company shares he had inherited, everything. It was all mine. The document was airtight. He had left no loopholes, no room for interpretation. He had built a fortress around me with his love and his foresight. He had protected me, even in death, but it was what I found tucked in behind the will that broke me. It was a single folded sheet of notebook paper, covered in his handwriting. It wasn't a legal document. It was a letter, addressed to me. My dearest Rory, if you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I am so sorry. I'm sorry for every moment we won't get to have, for every plan we won't see through. The thought of you having to go on without me is the only thing I have ever been truly afraid of. I know your family can be difficult. I know how much you've put up with over the years to keep the peace. You have a heart that is bigger and more forgiving than anyone I know, but your strength is what I've always admired most. You are stronger than you know. Everything I have is yours. Not just because you are my wife, but because you were my partner in building it. Every late night I worked, you were there. Every risk I took, you supported me. This isn't a gift. It is your half of everything we built together. It is yours to do with as you see fit. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for it. Don't let anyone tell you that you owe them a piece of it. Our life was ours, and its legacy belongs to you. Protect what we built. Protect yourself. Live a long, beautiful life. Find happiness again. That is all I could ever want for you. Forever yours. David, the tears I hadn't been able to shed for my family, I shed now for him. I clutched the letter to my chest, the paper crinkling under my fingers. The sobs came from a place so deep inside me, they felt like they were tearing me apart. They were tears of grief, of love, of gratitude. He had seen me. He had always seen me in a way my own parents never had. He knew my struggles, he knew my strength, and he had trusted me. He had trusted me to be strong enough to stand up to them. He had given me his last gift. Not the house, not the money. He had given me permission. Permission to fight. Permission to protect myself. Permission to choose my own path, free from the guilt and obligation that had shadowed my entire life. I sat there at his desk for hours, the letter and the will spread out before me. The first rays of dawn began to creep through the window, painting the room in soft shades of gray and pink. The deep, wrenching grief was still there, a wound that would never fully heal. But now, alongside it, something new was taking root. It was a quiet, cold resolve, a determination that was as solid and unshakable as the oak desk beneath my hands. My parents and my sister had betrayed me. They had abandoned me. They had tried to rob me. They had misjudged me completely. They saw me as a weak, grieving woman they could easily manipulate. They didn't know the woman David had loved. They didn't know the woman he had trusted. I folded his letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I put the will on top of it. I would not betray his trust. I would not let them tarnish his legacy. They had started a war when they chose a party over his funeral. They had escalated it when they came to my house with their hands out. They had no idea that David had just handed me all the ammunition I would ever need. I swore an oath in that silent study, a promise to the memory of my husband. I would not break. I would not bend. I would protect what we built, and I would show them what it meant to underestimate a woman with nothing left to lose. The quiet of my house became my sanctuary. In the days that followed my parents' disastrous visit, I did not leave. I unplugged the landline phone and kept my cell phone on silent, screening every call. The outside world, with its demands and its false sympathies, ceased to exist. My world was the four walls of the home I had shared with David, a fortress of memory and grief, but they wouldn't let me have even that. The assault began subtly, a series of text messages from my mother. The first one read, "Aurora, your father and I were just trying to help. You are overwrought with grief and not thinking clearly. Call me." I read it and deleted it. Overwrought. As if my pain were a temporary hysteria, a female flight of fancy that a good practical chat with her would cure. The next day, another one. "Clara is very hurt by your behavior. You are tearing this family apart with your selfishness." I stared at the word selfishness. They had left me to bury my husband alone so they could attend an engagement party, and I was the one being selfish. The audacity of it was almost comical. It was like an arsonist blaming the fire on the house for being flammable. I deleted the message without a second thought. Then came the calls. My phone would buzz on the coffee table, flashing Mom or Dad. I would watch it vibrate, my heart a cold, steady drum in my chest, and I would let it go to voicemail. The silence was my only reply. It was the only language they might eventually understand. Their voicemails started with a tone of strained patience. My mother's voice, tight with forced concern, would say, "Aurora, darling, please pick up. We're worried about you." My father's was more direct, clipped and angry. "This is ridiculous. You can't just ignore us. Call me back immediately." When I didn't respond, the tone began to shift. The mask of concern slipped, revealing the raw entitlement beneath. "Fine," my mother's voice snapped in one message, the sweetness gone, replaced by a shrill anger. "Be that way. Wallow in your own misery. But don't forget who your family is. You will regret pushing us away when you're all alone." All alone. The threat was so empty. They had already made me all alone. They couldn't take anything more from me. Then Clara started. Her attacks were more vicious, more personal. She, who had never had to fight for anything in her life, who had been handed everything on a silver platter, saw my refusal to hand over my inheritance as a personal insult. Her first voicemail was dripping with mock pity. "Rory, I heard what happened with Mom and Dad. I'm so sorry you're acting this way. I know you're hurting, but you don't have to be so bitter. David wouldn't have wanted you to be like this." Using his name felt like a violation. She had no right. She hadn't even bothered to show up to his funeral, and now she was presuming to know what he would have wanted. The hypocrisy was nauseating. I squeezed the phone in my hand, my knuckles white, but I did not reply. Her messages grew uglier. "You know, you're so selfish," she slurred in a late-night voicemail that reeked of wine and privilege. "You have all that money and that big house all to yourself, and I'm here trying to plan a wedding. My wedding! The happiest day of my life, and you're trying to ruin it. You've always been jealous of me, haven't you?" Jealous? The accusation was so absurd, so far from the truth, that I almost laughed. I had never been jealous of her. I had at times been jealous of how easy her life was, of the unconditional approval she received from our parents. But I had never wanted her life. I had my life. I had David, and she could never understand that what I had with him was worth more than all the money and parties in the world. Then Sarah, my best friend since kindergarten, the maid of honor at my wedding, called. I answered, a foolish flicker of hope in my chest. "Rory? Oh my God, finally. Are you okay?" she asked, her voice rushed. "I'm managing, Sarah," I said quietly. "Listen, I talked to Clara," she said, and my heart sank. "She's a wreck. Your mom said you threw them out of the house. What is going on with you? We're all so worried. They came here the day after the funeral to ask for David's money for Clara's wedding," I said, my voice flat. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well," Sarah said slowly, "Clara said you were being irrational, that they were just trying to talk about the future, to be practical. You know how your mom is." She was making excuses for them. My best friend. She was taking their side. "They weren't at the funeral, Sarah," I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. "None of you were." "Oh, Rory, don't be like that," she said, her voice turning condescending. "The party was planned for months. It was a huge deal for Clara. It was just terrible timing. You can't expect everyone to drop everything. Drop everything. As if my husband's funeral was a minor inconvenience like a dentist appointment. "I have to go, Sarah," I said, my voice cold. "Wait, Rory, don't hang up. We just want you to be reasonable." I ended the call. Then with a steady hand, I blocked her number. Then I blocked Clara's, then my mother's, then my father's. Each tap on the screen was a small, decisive act. A door closing, a lock turning. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer a passive state. It was an active creation. It was a wall I was building, brick by brick, around the life that was left to me. The first few days of total silence were the hardest. My thumb would hover over their contact names, the ingrained habit of a lifetime screaming at me to call, to explain, to smooth things over, to be the peacemaker I had always been. My mind played out the arguments I wanted to have, the things I wanted to scream at them. I typed out long, furious text messages, pouring all my pain and rage onto the screen, only to delete them letter by letter. Engaging with them would be giving them what they wanted. They wanted a fight. They wanted drama. They wanted to drag me down into their petty, selfish world. A fight would mean I was still connected to them. A fight would mean they still had a hold on me. My silence, I realized, was the most powerful weapon I had. It was a refusal to participate in their narrative. It was a mirror I was holding up to their behavior, and the reflection was so ugly they couldn't stand it. Their escalating anger was proof that it was working. They were shouting into a void, and the sound of their own voices echoing back at them was driving them mad. I began a new routine. I would wake up, make coffee, and sit in David's study. I started going through his papers, organizing his life's work, not as a chore, but as a way of communing with him. I read his books. I listened to his records. In the evenings, I would walk in the garden we had planted together, weeding the beds, tending to the life that was still growing there. The grief was my constant companion, a shadow that followed me everywhere. But it was a clean grief now, a pure grief for David. It was no longer contaminated by the toxic poison of my family's betrayal. One evening, as I was watering the roses, a line from David's letter came back to me. "You are stronger than you know." I had never felt strong. I had always felt like the quiet one, the overlooked one. I had bent and twisted myself into knots my entire life to win a scrap of their approval. But they had finally pushed me too far. They had broken the part of me that cared what they thought. They had abandoned me at the funeral, thinking it was the end of the story. They didn't realize it was the beginning of mine. They had left me for dead emotionally, but they had failed to realize that I was a seed, and they had just buried me in the dark, fertile ground of their own cruelty. I was starting to grow. They had abandoned me once, and it had shattered me. Now I was abandoning them. And in the self-imposed silence, in the solitude of my home, I was finally, for the first time in my life, finding myself. I was choosing peace over their chaos, dignity over their drama, and it was the most powerful feeling in the world. After 2 weeks of silence, I knew it was time to move from a defensive posture to an offensive one. My family's silence in return was not a sign of surrender. It was the quiet before a storm. They were regrouping, plotting their next move. Their sense of entitlement was a force of nature, like a hurricane, and it would not simply dissipate. They would come again, and I needed to be ready. I needed more than a locked door and a silent phone. I needed a fortress. I found David's lawyer, a man named Arthur Vance, through the paperwork in the study. His office was in a tall glass building downtown, a world away from the quiet grief of my suburban home. Walking into the polished lobby, I felt a tremor of my old self, the intimidated, quiet Aurora who was easily overwhelmed. But then I clutched my purse, the smooth leather cool against my fingers, and inside it was David's will and his letter. I was not here just for me. I was here for him. Arthur Vance was an older man with kind eyes and a firm handshake. He had known David for years. When I sat down in his office, he first offered his sincere condolences. He spoke of David's integrity and kindness, and for a few minutes we just shared memories. It was the first time I had spoken about David to someone who truly knew him, and it felt like a small release of a great pressure in my chest. Then, I told him everything. I told him about the funeral, about the engagement party, about the text messages, about my parents' visit and their demand for a share of the assets. I laid out the story in a calm, flat voice, the facts speaking for themselves. As I spoke, Arthur's kind expression slowly hardened into one of professional resolve. He steepled his fingers, his gaze sharp and focused. He was no longer just a grieving friend. He was a lawyer, and he was seeing the shape of the battle ahead. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Aurora, David was a smart man. His will is one of the most ironclad documents I have ever drafted. They don't have a legal leg to stand on." "I know," I said. "But they're not going to be thinking about the law. They're thinking about what they believe they're owed. They will try to bully me, to wear me down, Then we won't let them, he said, his voice firm. He pulled a yellow legal pad towards him. We are going to build a firewall. A legal wall so high and so thick they won't be able to get over it, under it, or through it. We will make it clear in no uncertain terms that the estate of David Miller is sealed, and you are its sole proprietor. For the next 2 hours, we planned. Arthur explained the process of probate, the legal validation of the will. He explained how we would file the will with the court and have me formally appointed as the executor. Once that was done, I would have the legal authority to manage all of David's assets. The first thing we will do, he said, scribbling notes, is send a formal notice from my office to your parents and your sister. It will state that all communication regarding the estate must now go through me. They are to have no further contact with you on this matter. If they try to contact you, you will not respond. You will simply forward the message or a record of the call to my office. A wave of relief washed over me. I would no longer have to bear the weight of their attacks alone. I would have a shield. Next, he continued, we will consolidate all the assets. We will contact the banks, the investment firms, the insurance company. We will have all accounts locked and transferred into a new estate account under your sole control. Their names are not on any of these accounts, are they? No, I said. David was always very private about his finances. Good, Arthur nodded. That makes it clean. We will also put a notice with the county recorder's office regarding the deed to your house, reinforcing your sole ownership. They won't be able to try anything clever, like putting a lien on the property. He was thinking of things I never would have imagined. He was seeing all the angles, all the dirty tricks they might try to pull. He was building my fortress, brick by legal brick. I left his office that day feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The grief was still there, a heavy coat I would always wear. But the fear, the feeling of being a cornered animal, was gone. Now I had a plan. I had an ally. The next morning, the notices were sent via registered mail. The day after, Arthur called to tell me they had been delivered and signed for. The first wall of my fortress was up. The silence that followed was different from before. It was a tense, simmering silence. I knew they were angry. I knew they were plotting. I could almost feel the heat of their rage from across town. The storm broke on a Saturday afternoon. I was in the kitchen trying to find the energy to eat when a car screeched to a halt in my driveway. I looked out the window to see my father's BMW parked haphazardly, one wheel on the lawn. He, my mother, and Clara all got out of the car. They looked furious. My heart began to pound, but I took a deep breath. You are stronger than you know. David's words. Arthur's instructions. Do not engage. Do not let them in. They marched up to the front door and began hammering on it with their fists. Aurora! Open this door right now, my father yelled, his voice muffled by the thick wood. I stood in the hallway, my back against the wall, my phone in my hand, ready to call the police if I had to. How dare you? My mother shrieked. Sending a lawyer after your own family. What is wrong with you? Then came Clara's voice, high and piercing. You can't do this. You can't just cut us off. That money is for my wedding. Dad promised. They shouted about fairness. They shouted about duty. They called me selfish, cold, and ungrateful. Their words were a barrage of poison, but they hit the solid wood of the door and fell harmlessly to the ground. They couldn't get in. They couldn't touch me. I waited for them to run out of steam. After about 10 minutes of them yelling at an unmoving door, their tirade began to falter. They were used to getting a reaction, to me folding under their pressure. My silence was disarming them. Finally, there was a lull. I knew this was my moment. I walked to the door, my footsteps silent on the rug. I didn't open it. I leaned my face close to the wood and spoke, my voice not much louder than a whisper, but clear and cold as ice. You left me alone at my husband's grave, I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. That was your choice. You left me once. I paused, letting the words sink in. I could hear them breathing on the other side of the door, their rage momentarily silenced by the shock of my response. Now I'm leaving you forever. I didn't wait for their reply. I turned and walked away from the door, back into the quiet of my house. I heard my father roar in frustration. I heard my mother start to cry, not with sadness, but with the theatrical rage of a thwarted narcissist. I heard Clara scream my name, the sound filled with impotent fury. Their noise was just that, noise. It had no power over me anymore. I walked into the study, sat in David's chair, and looked out the window at the garden. A few minutes later, I heard their car doors slam and the squeal of tires as they sped away. The house fell silent again, but this time it was a victor's silence. The fortress had held. The firewall was working. I had closed the door on them, not with a slam, but with a quiet, final click of a lock they would never be able to open again. And in that moment, I knew I was going to be okay. In the weeks that followed the confrontation at my door, a deep and profound quiet settled over my life. There were no more angry texts, no more screaming voicemails, no more hammering on my door. My firewall, both legal and emotional, was holding strong. I communicated with the outside world only through Arthur, my lawyer, who handled the final stages of the probate process with quiet efficiency. The estate was settled, the accounts were consolidated under my name, and the house was formally and indisputably mine. The legal battle was over before it had even begun. I expected to feel a sense of triumph, or perhaps a lingering anger. Instead, what I felt was a vast, quiet emptiness. The drama had been a distraction, a war to focus on, while the real enemy, my grief, lay in wait. Now, in the silence, I had to face it. I spent my days sorting through David's belongings, each object a memory, each memory a fresh wave of loss. It was a painful, necessary process. I was not erasing him. I was learning to carry him with me in a different way. I had no contact with my family, but news of their world still managed to trickle in, like toxic runoff seeping into a clean well. The first sign came from a distant cousin, my mother's niece, who called me one afternoon. She was a notorious gossip, but I answered, driven by a morbid curiosity I wasn't proud of. "Aurora, honey, I just heard the most awful thing," she began, her voice dripping with faux concern. "I heard your mother had to cancel the caterer for Clara's wedding. Something about a deposit bouncing? Is everything okay?" "I'm sure I wouldn't know," I said coolly. "We aren't speaking." "Oh," she said, her disappointment palpable. "Well, everyone is just so worried. They're saying your father's business is having issues." After I hung up, I sat with that piece of information. A bounced check. It was a small thing, but it was a crack in the perfect facade my parents had so carefully constructed their entire lives. They were the wealthy, successful branch of the family, the ones everyone else looked up to. A bounced check didn't fit the narrative. A week later, Arthur called me. "Aurora, I thought you should know. I received a call today from a Mr. Henderson, your father's financial advisor. He was making inquiries on behalf of your parents about accessing David's investment portfolio." "And what did you tell him?" I asked, my heart steady. I told him in no uncertain terms that the portfolio is the sole property of Mrs. Aurora Miller and is not accessible to any other party. I also informed him that any further attempts to inquire about your assets would be considered harassment. "What does it mean, Arthur?" he sighed. "It means they're desperate. From what I could gather without violating any confidences, it seems your father leveraged some of his own assets heavily to fund his business, and he was counting on using David's portfolio as collateral or liquidity for Clara's wedding, among other things. He seems to have promised your sister a lifestyle he couldn't actually afford without access to your inheritance." It all began to make sense. Their frantic anger, their desperation, my father's talk of supporting the family. He hadn't been talking about emotional support. He had been talking about financial support. He had overextended himself, promising my sister a fairy tale wedding and a down payment on a house, all while assuming he could use my dead husband's money as his personal bank. Their cruelty hadn't just been emotional, it had been transactional. They needed something from me, and their rage was the result of being denied it. The whispers I'd heard from my cousin soon grew into a roar that even I, in my self-imposed isolation, couldn't ignore. Clara's social media, once a constant stream of lavish wedding planning updates, dress fittings in designer boutiques, cake tastings at exclusive bakeries, photos of the grand historical mansion they had booked as a venue, went silent. Then, one evening, I saw a post from an old high school acquaintance who ran a floral design business. It was a vague but pointed message on her company's Facebook page. A reminder to all clients. Contracts are contracts, and deposits are non-refundable. We cannot hold a date for you if payments are not made on time. We are sorry for any inconvenience this may cause. She had been Clara's chosen florist. One by one, the pillars of their perfect party began to crumble. The mansion venue, as I later found out, canceled their booking due to missed payments. The renowned wedding planner they had hired publicly severed ties with them. The beautiful, glittering dream they had prioritized over my grief was dissolving into a humiliating public nightmare. Their perfect image, the one they had sacrificed me to maintain, was shattering for all to see. They had built their lives on a foundation of appearances, of projecting an image of effortless wealth and familial perfection. But it was all a house of cards, and they had been counting on David's assets, my assets, to be the load-bearing wall. When I removed that support, the whole structure came crashing down. Their collapse wasn't my victory. It was simply the consequence of their own choices. I hadn't sought revenge. I had simply refused to be a victim anymore. I had refused to set myself on fire to keep them warm. Their humiliation was a fire of their own making, fueled by their greed and arrogance. One Saturday in late spring, I was in the garden, planting a new bed of lilies, David's favorite. My hands were deep in the cool, dark earth. It was quiet and peaceful. The sun was warm on my back. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't pain or anger. It was a quiet, gentle sense of peace. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Hello? It was Clara. Her voice was thin, wrecked. She was crying. She must have gotten a new phone. Rory? She sobbed. You have to help me. Everything is ruined. Everything. I listened as she poured out the whole story, a torrent of self-pity and blame. The wedding was off. The venue was gone. Mark, her fiancé, was furious. Her parents were fighting constantly. It was all a disaster. She never once said she was sorry. She never once mentioned David. She just cried about her ruined party. I stood there in my garden, the scent of soil and flowers around me, and I listened to the sound of her world collapsing. I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, no satisfaction. Just a profound and final sense of distance. She was a stranger on the phone, crying about problems I could not solve and did not create. When she finally paused, catching her breath in a shuddering sob, I said, my voice calm and even, I can't help you, Clara. What? Why not? You have to. You have the money, she shrieked. No, I said simply. The life David and I built is not a solution to your problems. This is your life. You have to live it. And then I hung up. I blocked the new number. I put the phone away and turned back to my garden. I picked up my trowel and dug it into the earth, preparing the ground for a new lily bulb. I was planting new life. I was tending to my own garden. Their world could fall apart. Mine was just beginning to grow again. Months passed, turning the raw, wounded landscape of my life into something quieter and more manageable. Autumn gave way to a cold, stark winter, and then slowly, tentatively, the first signs of spring began to appear. I watched from my window as green shoots pushed their way through the hard soil in my garden, and I felt a kinship with them. I, too, was pushing my way towards the light after a long season of darkness. My life found a new rhythm, one dictated not by family obligations or drama, but by my own needs. I woke with the sun, drank my coffee in the quiet study, and spent my days sorting through the life David and I had built. Some days were hard, filled with a grief so heavy it felt like I was moving through water. On those days, I allowed myself to rest. Other days were better. I started volunteering at the local library, the simple, quiet work of shelving books a balm to my soul. I reconnected with a few old college friends, people who were untangled from the web of my family and who simply accepted my loss without judgment. I never heard from my parents or sister again. After Clara's final, desperate phone call, the silence from their end was absolute. Through Arthur, I learned that my father had sold his struggling business at a loss, and they had downsized from their large family home to a small condo across town. Their world had shrunk, brought low by the weight of their own pride and financial mismanagement. I took no pleasure in this knowledge. It was simply a fact, like the changing of the seasons. Their story was no longer my story. Then, one bright Saturday in May, I woke up with a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. It took me a moment to place it. I checked the calendar on my kitchen wall. May 18th. It was the day that was supposed to have been Clara's wedding. A ghost of my former self stirred within me. The old Aurora, the one who was conditioned to care, felt a flicker of morbid curiosity. I wondered what they were doing. Had they managed to scrape together some smaller, less grand affair? Or was the day passing in a shroud of bitter, resentful silence in their small condo? For a moment, I was tempted to look, to search for some clue on social media, to ask one of the distant relatives who still occasionally sent me placid, questioning texts. I walked to the living room window and looked out at the garden. The lilies I had planted were in full bloom, their white petals open to the sun. They were beautiful, serene, and vibrantly alive. They were David's favorite, and in that moment, the choice became clear. I could spend the day looking back, peering into the wreckage of a life that was no longer mine, or I could spend it looking forward, tending to the life I had now. I could give them my time, my energy, my thoughts, or I could give them to David. I went to the garden and cut the most beautiful lilies, their stems cool and firm in my hand. I arranged them carefully in a vase and placed them in my car. The drive to the cemetery was different this time. The first time, the world had been a gray, hostile blur. Today, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The trees were lush and green. I drove with the windows down, feeling the warm spring air on my skin. I wasn't driving to a place of endings, but to a place of love and memory. His grave was on a gentle slope overlooking a small pond. The temporary marker had been replaced with a simple, elegant headstone of dark gray granite. David Miller, beloved husband. I had spent weeks choosing the stone, the font, the words. It felt right, simple, strong, and true. I knelt on the soft grass and began to clear away the few small weeds that had sprouted. I polished the stone with a soft cloth until it shone in the sun. Then, one by one, I took the lilies and laid them on the grass in front of the headstone. The white of the flowers stood out against the green of the earth. I sat there for a long time, my hand resting on the cool stone, and I talked to him. I told him about my days. I told him about the library, about the garden, about the quiet peace I was beginning to find. I told him how much I missed his laugh, his advice, the simple comfort of his presence. I protected what we built, I whispered to the silent stone. I did what you asked. I was strong. I thought about my family, about their betrayal, their cruelty, their stunning lack of empathy. I thought about the emptiness of the church, the coldness of their words, the greed in their eyes. For months, their memory had been a source of burning anger and pain. But now, sitting here in this peaceful place, I felt a shift. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound and final sense of release. They had no more power over me. Their judgment, their expectations, their drama, it was all just noise from a distant foreign country. I finally understood. My freedom wasn't about the money or the house. It was about severing the tie of obligation to people who did not love me. It was about refusing to live by their definition of family. On the day of her wedding, I wasn't there. Instead, I laid lilies on my husband's grave. They abandoned me, I whispered, my voice clear and steady in the quiet air. But I've buried them too. Not in soil, but in truth. And for the first time, I felt free. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby oak tree. I got to my feet, my knees aching slightly from the ground. I took one last look at the grave, at the beautiful white lilies. I said my goodbye, a quiet promise to return. Then I turned and walked away, my shadow long on the grass behind me. I did not look back. I walked towards my car, towards the road, towards the rest of my life. The path ahead was unknown, but for the first time, it was completely and utterly my own. If you've ever stood alone when family should have stood beside you, know this: you are not weak. You are stronger than they'll ever admit. Share your story in the comments, subscribe for more, and never let silence erase you.